I ended the previous episode of this series by saying that Islam, from its very early days, made it clear that it is not a social movement to reform the Arab society at the time, the 7th century, and that it is not a political movement revolting against the ruling structures in Arabia at the time, but that it is a faith, it is a religion. And it centered itself on the submission to the oneness of God. But that idea, the oneness of God, was not very new to the Arabs of the time. I explained in a previous episode about the religious landscape in Arabia in the 6th and 7th centuries, that there existed at the time quite an established stream of Judaism in Arabia. There were also echoes of Christianity that had reached Arabia at that time, though what was the echoes of these Christianity at the time were very different actually from what later on became Eastern Christianity. But because of these two traditions, the idea of the oneness of God was familiar to the Arabs. At least they could relate to the idea somehow. And even paganism, which I explained before, had two major streams in Arabia at the time. But paganism in general, also in it, the Arabs had a conception of a grand God who presides over a structure of divinity that includes angels and demons and daughters and supreme beings and different other creatures. But even within that, the idea of a grand God that is one presiding over everything was also familiar to the Arabs. And therefore, it was very important that Islam puts forward its own scope of the oneness of God, its own scope, understanding that it can present to humanity about God. And it did. It put forward that God is absolutely one, and one in absolute, that God is indivisible, that He has no origins, no traceability, no lineage. The notion of God itself, and God was not begotten, that God has no following, has no succession, that the notion of God, that God is not to begetteth, and that there's nothing like God, nothing like Him, like the notion of God in itself or unto itself. Now, as you can imagine, these words, whether you read them in the original Arabic or you read them in different languages, depending on the different interpretations, many interpretations, and many, of course, translations, they ignited so many views, so many thinking streams within Islam on what they mean. So there was a literal understanding, and actually, over the following years, few literal understandings. There was a historical interpretation of these words. By that I mean that there were ideas that tried to interpret those words in the historicity of the story of creation, but here focusing on God in the story of creation. There were interpretations that were very metaphorical. So those put forward figurations about the notions of God and elaborated a lot on those figurations. There were philosophical interpretations, and in those those words, those descriptions, such a scope of the oneness of God and scope of God, were put in concepts, philosophical concepts. And there were suggestible contexts or interpretations that later on appeared in Islam, and those very much invited the human imagination to take these words and run with them, to conceive of the notion of God, to conceive of God in myriad of ways. And all of that happened in the next 350 or 400 years, basically the first 4 centuries of the history of Islam. We found so many of those ideas in those literal, historical, metaphorical, philosophical, suggestible ways that enriched massively Islamic thinking. But what's important for me here in this episode, when we are looking at Islam at its very early days, that Islam not only made it very clear from its very early days that it is a religion, but it centered the religion on the oneness of God, and it put forward an exact conception of the oneness of God and of God.